This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. And now for something completely different. Clearly this isn't a painting, although it is decorated with paint and the support is wood, just like the Mona Lisa and basically every painting from the Renaissance, so maybe it is a painting. I don't know. But one thing I do know is that it is broken and I can fix it. Now, this sculpture by Ida Kohlmeyer came into the studio after a particularly nasty car ride. And during that ride, several of the appendages broke off. As you can see, they are no longer attached to the main body of the sculpture. And this isn't this sculpture's first go-round with repair and trauma. You can also see that there's quite a bit of glue in these little joints. And that's indicative not only of the artist's original construction, but of several previous attempts at repair. And I know this because the owners told me they tried to repair it several times. And that's something that I'm going to have to deal with in the course of putting this little sculpture back together. But of course, the first thing I want to do is get it clean, because even though it looks pretty bright and pretty wild and pretty good, it's actually pretty dirty. Now, this sculpture sat on a pedestal and then on a bookshelf and then in a storage room and then in the car for several years. And over that period, over that time, it accumulated a fairly healthy dusting of dirt and grime. And most of that is just ambient dust and particulate that settles on the surface of any object that isn't cleaned all that often. And the good news is that this piece is fairly robust. The paint is acrylic, and so it is pretty healthy, it's pretty flexible, and the wood is in really good condition. By all accounts, this piece has been fairly well cared for, aside from the go-around in the back seat of the car. So all I have to do to clean it is really remove this surface grime. Now, there's no varnish on this piece, and it's a relatively new piece or young piece, so it hasn't been subject to years or decades of tobacco smoke or sitting over a fireplace and soot or other things that can cause paintings to get dirty, like cooking oils or coal-burning fireplaces or oil-burning furnaces. And this is really just a case of ambient particulate settling on the surface. But as you can see, using a Q-tip or cotton swab and a mild cleaning solution, I can lift off all of this grime and we can get a better idea of what the colors should be and how the piece should look. Now, cleaning acrylic paint isn't all that different than cleaning oil, except it is much more sensitive to solvents. In fact, just about any aromatic solvent will do extreme damage to the acrylic, because if we remember, acrylic is basically just plastic, and aromatic solvents will attack plastics. Now, in this case, as I mentioned before, there's no varnish, so I don't need to use any petroleum solvents, aromatic solvents, or hydrocarbons to remove any of that varnish. So I'm really lucky. If that were the case, it would be a little bit more problematic. Now, there are areas of this piece that don't really look all that dirty until you start cleaning them, and then you can see just how much accumulated dirt, dust, and grime is on the piece. And this is something that I always recommend my clients embark upon when a piece comes in for repair. It's good practice to clean the painting or the sculpture, and if it hasn't been cleaned in a long time, the results are going to be pretty dramatic. And sometimes my clients tell me that the piece doesn't need to be cleaned because it hasn't been subject to anything that would cause it to be dirty. And then I make some tests and I show them just how dirty their homes really are, and they are impressed and embarrassed, and usually they go ahead with the cleaning. Now, anything that sits in a home or a gallery or even a museum for long enough is going to have an accumulation on it. That's just kind of part and parcel with being in the world. And it's not necessarily problematic. It just kind of is what it is. And in this case, we're lucky that it's just a light coating of dust and dirt and particulate. That stuff comes off really easily with this solution that I'm using. And you can see just how different the piece looks once that area has been cleaned. I mean, those colors are really jumping out, and before it looked good, but comparatively, the part that hasn't been cleaned looks pretty lousy right now. So I'm really happy that the clients allowed me to go ahead, or at least listen to me when I suggested that they go ahead and clean the piece. Now, before I can get started putting this sculpture back together, I have to address the old work, much like I do when I'm working on a painting. I need to remove all of this old work so that I can start fresh, and I can start with the original materials. And in this case, the old work that I have to remove is all of the adhesive that was added during the previous repair attempts. And the owners told me that this was likely an epoxy bought at the hardware store that they used, and it is what it is. Since they fessed up and they owned up to these issues, I'm not going to rake them over the coals. Suffice to say that hardware store epoxy is not really a great material for conservation. It yellows, it ages poorly, and it's not reversible. So that in and of itself is a fundamental failure. Now I need to excavate and remove all of this old epoxy so that I can reveal the original wood so that I can have a better surface onto which to apply my adhesive. In addition, all of that built up old adhesive has set the pieces askew. That is, they are no longer in their proper orientation. And so I'll use pretty much any tool I have at my disposal. You saw me using my scalpel, and now I'm using my Fordham tool to remove all of this old adhesive. And once it's done, I can begin thinking about how I'm going to go forward and put this piece back together. Now we know that those little pieces had broken off many times before, both anecdotally from the owners and from the evidence of previous repairs. And that's why I'm not leaving anything to chance. I'm going to be using these little hardwood dowels to provide a little bit of extra support so that those little pieces aren't out there flying off in the universe on their own, left alone. I mean, it's nice to have a little bit of extra support, right? And there's no place where having support is more necessary than when it comes to your website. Because most of us aren't professional web designers or coders, and so when, not if, but when something goes wrong, it's nice to know that somebody's got your back. And that's where Squarespace is different. Because aside from having tons of online tutorials and guides, they have webinars so that you can learn how to use your platform. And if that doesn't suffice, there is an online community of people just like you ready to answer your questions. And if that doesn't cut it, you can reach out to Squarespace directly and get in touch with a real human who will walk you through any issue you may have. So aside from gorgeous, mobile-friendly templates that work everywhere, integrated e-commerce solutions, and cross-platform capabilities, Squarespace really does have your back, so you aren't out there floating off in the ether like those little broken sculpture pieces. And that's kind of a good feeling, right? So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Okay, now that you're supported with Squarespace, I have to figure out a way to implement these dowel supports. And the first thing that I'm going to be doing is creating an index system. And I'm doing this with a piece of bookbinding tape. And this is acid-free, pH-neutral, acrylic adhesive tape that's used in bookbinding and book repair. And I'm placing it on these little appendages or little fingers that come out of the sculpture. And I'm going to place it on two sides of the sculpture so that I have two lines in space. And once I do this, I will be able to create an index, so to speak, of where this little piece should be out in the world. Now, generally, if I was using dowels on a piece of furniture where I had two right angles, it would be really easy to create an index, but I don't, so I have to use lasers. Yeah, lasers, but not the pew-pew kind. These are just leveling lasers, and I've set them up on tripods, and I have placed the little appendage in its proper orientation, and I am aligning the lasers with those two index lines. And once I get them set, I will have a reference point, two reference points in fact, each laser line, in space that will properly align this little piece once I remove it. So I can remove this piece and put it back on, and I'll know exactly where it should go. And this is really important, because without this, there's pretty much no way that I would be able to ensure that once I put this dowel in place, that this little appendage would be properly aligned. But how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to use my Fordham with a drill bit, and I'm going to line the drill bit against those two laser lines, and I'm going to drill a hole into the sculpture's body. And once I get this little drill bit aligned right about there, I can start drilling that hole, and I will know that that hole is in alignment with those two lasers, which are in alignment with the little appendage. So I will know that that hole is properly aligned with the appendage. And now once this hole is drilled, and I'm not going terribly deep, about 1 centimeter into the sculpture, once this hole is drilled, I will be able to insert that dowel, and we'll see that it's going to align properly. At least, I hope so. Otherwise, I'm in big trouble. Well, of course, you can see that it is properly aligned. And we can see that that dowel and those lasers line up perfectly. Well, okay, so I've got the dowel aligned perfectly, but I still have to deal with the appendage. And I'm going to be doing basically the same thing. I've moved the appendage over to a clamp on my vise, and I'm going to hold it in place. And again, I'm going to align those lasers with the index lines that I put on the tape that I adhered to the little appendage. And once I have those set, I will again have two reference lines in space that I will use with the Fordham and the drill bit to bore a hole into that little appendage. And again, because the Fordham is going to be aligned with these two tape lines by way of the laser, I'll know that that dowel is going to be perfectly aligned with the position of the little appendage that I set originally. It's kind of hard to explain, but if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If I don't have a physical aligning tool, I can create one, and that's where the use of the lasers is really, really helpful. And so, as you can see, as I work to get these lasers aligned properly, it takes a little bit of effort because they're really, really delicate and really sensitive, actually. But once I have them in place, then it's really not all that hard to bore the hole. Start it off and then make sure that the drill bit is properly aligned with those lasers, and we know that that hole is perfectly straight and exactly where we want it to be. And so what initially seemed really complicated is now really simple. All right, enough with the talk, Julian. Let's see it in action. Proof is in the pudding. In goes the dowel, and then in goes the appendage, and it's aligned exactly where I want it to be. And you can see here just how that seam lines up perfectly. And here again, look at the seam. Perfect alignment. And now into the easy part, putting it back together. And that kind of sounds crazy because normally this is the hard part, but with all the work that I've done earlier, this is going to go very well. Now I'm using a room temperature modified hide glue, but I've warmed it up because it gives better flow. And I'm using a hide glue as opposed to something like epoxy because it's completely reversible. And that is, not only does it give a really good bond when used against wood, but with a little bit of warm water or warm water and vinegar, I can remove this. Now, I don't know why anybody would want to remove this, but that's not for me to say. It's just my responsibility to make sure that it can be removed in the future. Now I'm going to be adding something to this joint, and it's a little bit of putty. But instead of using water as a binder, it also uses hide glue. So not only is it a gap filler, because there probably is a small gap, but it's also going to act as an adhesive. So in a sense, it's kind of like Framer's composition, but it's fully removable, fully reversible, and it's going to fill in those little gaps where some of the wood was lost or where the glue had chipped away. Again, hide glue in the joint, hide glue on the surface of the wood so that I can ensure I'm getting a really good bond, and then I can put the little appendage back in. And I can use the dowel to make sure that it's properly aligned. And then all of that extra putty is going to squeeze out and make sure that there are no gaps that need to be filled in later. And now once I've completed that process for all 4 of the little appendages that were broken off, I can take the next step in making sure that they have a really good glue joint. And that step involves clamping. And so I'm taking a piece of polyethylene foam and I'm cutting it into little pieces. And I'm going to cut little V's or grooves into these pieces of polyethylene foam so that they can clamp around and hold on to the little appendages very well. I want to make sure that there's enough support there. So I'll place these onto the appendages, and then I'll use a couple of silicone clamping straps. And I'm using these silicone clamping straps because it would be almost impossible to use rigid clamps in this case. I could vector clamp all of this, but that would involve creating so many additional pieces of wood to create those vectors that it would be absurd. Not to mention, I would only be able to clamp one of these things at a time. But by using these stretchy silicone clamping straps, I can ensure that each one of these little appendages gets clamped down with a good amount of pressure to make sure that that glue joint holds. I can do them all at the same time, and I don't have to worry about loading this pretty delicate and kind of wonky little sculpture up with lots of rigid pipe clamps or spring clamps or band clamps or anything like that that could possibly fall down or get in the way. There's nothing all that complicated about these, and I don't need a ton of pressure. I'm not looking for 200 psi. In fact, I'm probably looking for less than 50 psi. Most of the work is going to be done by those dowels. The surface of the little appendages and the surface of the sculpture that have adhesive on them, those are important, but because those were compromised by all the previous repairs, I've transferred much of the support structure to those dowels. And so with this little sculpture all clamped up, I can leave it for a day or two, and then I'll be ready to do the final touch-up and make it look great. Now it's been a couple of days, and I've allowed the glue to set up and the putty to dry, and I had to do some other things, so I kind of lost track of this piece for a minute there. But everything is ready to come out of the clamps, and it's really easy to remove these silicone clamp straps. I could just cut them off if I wanted, but I'm probably going to try to reuse them in the future because they're a pretty valuable little resource, and I don't see any reason why I shouldn't save them. So once I get them all removed, I can size up how the gluing process went and make sure that none of it needs to be redone. And these are really well bonded. I do not think that there is any question that these are secure. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove all of that excess putty that's squeezed out of that glue joint. And you can see it's somewhat flexible. It will continue to harden over the next couple days as all of that excess moisture that's in there evaporates. But you can see that it's pretty easy to work with a sharp scalpel. And if I need other tools such as dental tools or little files, I can employ those. But if I get to it before it fully hardens, it's pretty easy to remove. Now once I remove all of this excess putty, you're going to see that there's very little remaining. This is not a gap filler that was necessary to fill large sections of missing wood. If that were the case, I would have either carved a piece of wood or used a wood filler. In this case, it's just a little crack and little gaps that needed to be filled. And it was easier to do it then while everything was in pieces than it would be to do it now, where I would have to use little tools to get that putty into place and then manipulate it and clean it all off. And certainly not impossible, and I've done it that way before, but I've also learned from doing it that way, and this is much easier. So I can remove any excess with a little bit of warm water, and then I can start the retouching process. And it is much like retouching a painting with a couple of key differences, and those differences are very important. Now, if you remembered from earlier, I mentioned that this piece is made of acrylic on wood, and that's important because acrylic paint is vulnerable to petroleum solvents, sometimes hydrocarbon, but definitely aromatics. And that means that I can't use my preferred retouching paints because to remove them requires a slight aromatic solution. So what I'm doing is using a very high quality, high density watercolor. And this is Golden's QOR, which is a really phenomenal watercolor, really expensive, but it's got a high pigment content and the binder is really, really good. So it's an ideal medium for retouching on acrylics and other paint surfaces that can't accept solvents. And just like retouching on a painting, this is retouching, but a little bit more 3D. I'm just trying to add paint where paint is missing, and this is a little bit tricky because there was a lot of old retouching done on this, and I don't know if that was done by the owners or somebody else. So the color is a little bit hard to match. I want to make sure that I match it, but there's some discoloration around the original area. So I'm going to have to take a couple goes and see how it looks. But ultimately, I'll get there. It's not terribly complicated, and I've done this once or twice before. Again, just working slowly with a really sharp tipped brush to make sure that I just get paint where paint is missing. I'm not looking to repaint this whole area. That's not my job. That's not what I want to do. I just want to touch up that little gap where that putty was. And you can see just how important that putty was, because without it, there would be a textural difference. And I could certainly paint over that textural difference, but your eye would catch it as the light rakes across it. And that's one thing that's really important in conservation. Even if your color matching is correct, if your texture matching isn't, all of that accuracy in color matching just isn't going to matter. And little things like this, like carrying the black line down to the edge, make all the difference. These are the things that allow your eye to see this as a unified whole as opposed to a repair. And that's something that we want. And so just by adding this little piece of black paint, all of a sudden, it just looks more natural. And just like that, the piece is all back together. This little sculpture is ready to go back up onto the pedestal, the bookshelf, or, hey, if it's going to the backseat of the car, so be it. But one thing we can rest assured is that these little appendages are not going to snap off like last time. They are really well secured. And so while this was slightly a departure from what I normally do, when you think about it, it kind of fits right in. I mean, it's paint, there's wood, there was some damage, the structural integrity was compromised, and the artist's original vision was compromised. And so this kind of falls right within my wheelhouse as a conservator. So thanks for coming along and seeing me do something that's a little bit different. I enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. As always, go ahead and subscribe and stay tuned for some more.